One of the byproducts of getting to host this thing or even attend, I hope for the rest of you, is that, yeah, hopefully we have good presenters and panel discussions and fireside chats, but at lunch you get to sit with somebody different and have some really, really interesting conversations. Some of them outside your normal focal area, which certain happened to me today. I had a wonderful lunch talking about all kinds of cybersecurity. Again, things that are outside my area. So we are going to go back on time here. I suspect there were a few people who are a little slower than the rest of us on lunch that may be funneling in, but it looks like the majority of us are here. So it's my great, great pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker, who I had never met a year ago. And the development office here at the university said, hey, there's an alum that's coming back to campus and it looks like he does some pretty cool stuff. And he mentioned cybersecurity is kind of one of those areas that he dabbles in. And we're trying to figure out who to put on the itinerary for his visit to campus. Would you be interested? And like, anytime somebody mentions cybersecurity, we're probably interested in meeting with them. And so did the quick Google search and read the LinkedIn and replied back ways like, we must be on his agenda. And so no surprising, when he came down and we sat down in a conference room and ideas just started flowing, learning each other. And it was decided right there and then, like, listen, we need to get you back to campus when we do much deeper dive. And so while some continuing conversations, and I'm not going to talk about some of our long-term grand plans that we have, but just the technology and the research that Snehal company has come up with is unbelievable. And not a very good use of his time, I guess, or hopefully this is a good use of his time, but not only here today to speak, but he's back in 2 weeks to be honored by the university as a distinguished alum of the computer science department. So it is my great pleasure to present Snehal Antani, who is the CEO and founder of Horizon 3 AI and the Innovation Hub. Horizon 3 AI, I'm sure he'll talk about a little bit, but it's a cybersecurity company that has a very novel approach. It does use AI, but more than AI as a buzzword to actually do autonomous pen testing. I've never seen anything like it. Spaff was in that room with our, and Spaff usually has seen or thought of or heard of something. He's like, that is a cool idea. So it's not very often that Spaff says, that's cool, and I'd never even thought of that. But before his venture into being an entrepreneur and starting this company and developing his own technologies, Snehal had worked as the very first CTO for the U.S. military's Joint Special Operations Command. Those of you who had spent time in uniform, JSOC. And so worked at the very core of cybersecurity and national defense. Certainly, I suspect some of those lessons learned have helped shape what the company has done and some of his vision, because some of these novel approaches, again, just kind of blew us away, and we are honored to have him here. So Snehal, welcome.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. I joke that the JSOC's like Bruno, we don't talk about it. So that, and coincidentally, distinguished science alumni, given my dad, when we found out, said, given you barely graduated the program, congratulations. I said, thank you, sir. And to put in perspective, Professor Wagstaff was my 426 professor in 2002, right? And it's amazing to see some of the folks here. So Snehal Antani, my background, I graduated computer science in 2002, started my career as a software engineer at IBM, focused on distributed systems, worked my way to be a CIO in financial services, and then the CTO at Splunk, and helped grow to scale that company. And then decided to take a break from industry to serve within the special operations community. And in fact, one of the people that kind of inspired me to think about public service is also here, which is Neil Ziering. And Neil, I don't think you realize this, but when you visited Splunk that one day in the boardroom, conversations that we had, I'm like, I've never actually solved problems that matter. And I would really like to take a chance to take a step back and solve problems that truly matter to me, that make a difference. And there was no better place to do that than a place like Joint Special Operations Command. So with that, in every one of my jobs, as a CIO, a CTO, owning cybersecurity, overseeing it, I was plagued by a single question by my leadership, which is, how do you know we're secure? It was a very frustrating question to be asked by the regulators when I was on Wall Street and elsewhere, because when you unpack that, am I logging the right data? Am I fixing the right vulnerabilities? Does my team actually know how to detect and respond to a breach? And the question is, we don't know. We've got to sit around and wait for a breach to find out. And only then have we stressed our infrastructure. And this was a very unsustainable approach towards verifying my security posture. So I went on this journey to figure out, how do I identify my exploitable attack surface? Because the other problem to solve is, being vulnerable doesn't mean I'm exploitable. If you look at most of the CVs that get announced out there, to exploit them requires you be in the data center, standing on one leg with a twisted bowl in the air, plugging in a thumb drive. I mean, the conditions to exploit are so obtuse that it's not worth the time and effort to go off and patch or take action. And the hardest part of my job as a CIO was deciding what not to fix. So I wanted to be able to look at my environment through the eyes of the attacker and use that perspective to identify the exploitable attack surface and fix problems that truly mattered. So I go down this journey, and the first thing I do is make the business case that we need to go off and run pen tests against the organization. And the business case is pretty straightforward: $50K for a pen test, $500K for ransomware. And by the way, any presentation that has Drake, is going to be a good presentation. Then we go off and prepare as a team. We know that the pen test is going to come. We're going to harden our environment. We're going to look really good when this happens. And then the pen testers show up and own us. I don't know if it's too soon for this meme, but whatever it is. And then we submit the report to the auditors, and this year's report looks exactly like last year's report. And this is a very unsustainable trajectory. And what I really wanted to get to was this continuous motion of find, fix, verify. I wanted to continuously find my exploitable attack surface. And the more often my environment changes, the more often I should be finding what's exploitable. And so change in environment should be directly correlated with frequency of testing and validation. The next thing is to fix the problems that truly matter. And what's interesting is if you take some of the SMB problems that you'll find in an environment, by default, an SMB null bind or whatever it might be is a 1 out of 10 CVSS score. As a CIO, I would have never paid attention to those types of issues. But if you chain that particular misconfiguration with credentials harvested from one place and a misconfigured in another, you can actually use that to become a domain admin. And so context actually matters as you are deciding what to fix or what not to fix. And then the final part is, when you're running pen tests in your organization, you've basically stimulated your defensive tools. And you want to understand, what did Splunk see? What did CrowdStrike see? Do I have blind spots in my logging? Do I have blind spots in my detection and response? Is my MSSP actually detecting and responding within their SLAs? So you want to be able to integrate this idea of detection engineering disciplines and practices into this loop. As I went through the journey of trying to build this out, I realized nothing existed. And then I got to study and spend a lot of time understanding the offensive side of the house, which was incredibly useful. It gave me ideas. And what I realized is, infrastructure pen testing is a knowledge graph analytics problem. And that was kind of the starting point. There's this Microsoft quote, defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. And you take that as a starting point. And my question was, could I come up with effectively a digital weapon that doesn't require any sort of scripting, any sort of notion or understanding the environment, no cheating whatsoever, to drop in blind, conduct recon and discovery and enumeration, and then use that to do next best actions, Markov decision processes, and different types of reward functions to achieve an outcome. And that outcome could be become a domain admin, compromise sensitive data, borrow into critical networking components, and so on. But there are 10 to 12 well-defined outcomes that an adversary wants to go off and achieve. And so that became the bet that we want to go off and make. And the thing in starting a company is addressable user base. There are only 5,000 certified ethical hackers in the United States, OSCP certified. And that number has, for the most part, been flat over the last 10 years, maybe some slight growth. And it takes about 10 years on average to go from an apprentice to journeyman to master hacker through the NSA program and everywhere else. So there's a long lead time to building well-skilled ethical hackers. So what we went off and did was said, okay, I know that we've got a huge constraint in supply, and at the same time, we've got a huge spike in demand. When I was a CIO, I cared about my attack surface being my on-prem infrastructure, my perimeter, and my insider threat. If I was the CIO again, I would have to add the multiple clouds, multiple SaaS services where I've got sensitive data, my IoT infrastructure. Think of COVID when people rapidly integrated COVID temperature sensors into their network. You've got your industrial attack surface that I talked about earlier. Your attack surface has skyrocketed, compliance has skyrocketed. So we needed to change this equation. And one of the things I talked quite a bit about when I was here last time at Purdue is this role of entrepreneurship, finding a problem that matters, building that early team, and how do we start to share those experiences and mistakes and lessons learned to build more entrepreneurial impact out of the Purdue ecosystem too. The way I thought about it is, how do I get pen testing into the hands of IT admins, network engineers, and 9-year-olds like Daniel that are not certified ethical hackers? But by democratizing this idea of verifying your security posture, we're able to catch problems way left of bang. And so Daniel runs a pen test against my company, and in a few clicks, he's going to run an attack that's going to do recon and enumeration of the perimeter. It is going to find a misconfigured Kubernetes cluster and get code executed. From there, it is going to do internal recon and enumeration, fingerprint a particular Windows box, get code execution, dump credentials, and then use those credentials to crack those credentials using open source intelligence, dark web data, and so on. Attackers don't hack in like you see in the movies. Often they log in with credentials that they've collected through one way or the other. And the FBI folks yesterday morning talked quite a bit about that. And once you've got credentials, domain user credentials as an example, you're able to live off the land and snowball that into something more significant. You're able to gain access to all of the data that that domain user has access to. You're able to dump SAM and apply other techniques to elevate privileges to become domain administrator. The bulk of these attacks don't require any CVEs to be exploited. And attackers know this, and attackers have adapted to looking for ways to chain together credentials and misconfigurations versus a CVE that's in the news. And this is the idea, is how do you get yourself to proactively verify your security posture? And the novel piece here from an engineering standpoint is the more pen tests we run, the smarter we get, because through reinforcement learning and the reward functions, we're able to understand what is the next best action to take to achieve compromise, and what is the next best action to take that is safe for production, and so on and so forth. And so you end up building this data moat over time through the reinforcement learning mechanisms that start to make these tests get smarter and more effective run after run. So what's interesting here now is a few stories. I want to share these stories from about 10,000 pen tests a year that we run. To put that in perspective, that is more pen tests per year that we execute than IBM, TCS, EY, Deloitte, and others in total. So we've run more pen tests as a single company than all of them combined. So I'm going to share 4 stories to kind of talk through real life attack paths and then tee up why this matters, and also at the end why Purdue matters from my point of view. The first is a pen test against, this is a bank against 5,000 hosts within their environment. Most good security shops assume compromise. They assume the attacker is going to get in because there's way too many doors and windows in the infrastructure, and they're going to get initial access to the environment. In addition, there are already initial access brokers out there that a threat actor can use to purchase their way in if they wanted to. So you assume compromise and figure out what your soft, squishy center is within the enterprise or within the organization. So from there, you start to execute recon and enumeration, and you start to discover every host that's networkable. If you have segmentation and your segmentation is misconfigured, an attacker is going to be able to break out. And you want to be able to understand, can an attacker start in my guest network and break out to my corporate network? Can they start in my customer success support segment and break out to my engineering segment or to my finance segment, and so on? As you execute recon and enumeration, this is kind of my observation from a government standpoint and from a research standpoint, you organize that information into cyber terrain maps, knowledge graphs that represent the host, port, services, credentials, and so on that have been collected. And so what's important is these cyber terrain maps are not intended to be human readable. These are machine readable knowledge graphs that start to serve the underlying infrastructure for next best actions as you execute. Now, in this particular attack, this customer had Fortinet installed as their endpoint security product. Yet the product, our AI was able to get initial or compromise and get code execution on a particular host, dump those credentials, And then from those credentials, laterally maneuver to, or credential pivot to become domain admin elsewhere in the environment. And the big question to ask by this particular customer was, wait, we bought Fortinet, we had the right tools in place, we checked all the boxes from a defensive standpoint, yet you were still able to compromise, and not a single security alert was triggered in this attack. What happened? Well, what happened was their automation that deploys Fortinet agents against their 5,000 endpoints failed on 3 machines, and they had no idea. And I know Rob kind of chastised this comment, but attackers only have to be right once. All it takes is one misconfigured machine for the attacker to gain initial access, and from there live off the land. The second thing that was a little bit more awkward, and for those that deal with vendors, you'll appreciate this. The Fortinet marketing brochure said that they could stop credential pivoting, yet we were able to prove that we could do it. And it turned out that the customer bought the wrong modules from Fortinet, which is a very awkward conversation to have from a sales standpoint. That was a very delicious call for me to sit and watch them, argue back and forth. So even though you do the right things, you've got to verify your security posture, and you want to do so in a way that isn't waiting for the bad guys to show up. And that was kind of one of the really interesting early wins or early stories. The next example is this idea that attackers don't hack in, they log in. So a very common technique that attackers will take is once they've gained initial access, they'll start to do man-in-the-middle techniques to listen for hashes being passed along the wire. And if you've got misconfigurations in DNS, they allow for multicast broadcast of hashes. An attacker is going to use tools like Responder to collect those NTLM hashes. And then they're going to pass that hash to go off and crack. And then once you've cracked a hash and you've got a valid user ID password pair, you've got access to all of the data and systems that end user has access to. So in this case, they did not have MFA turned on for Office 365. We're able to gain gain access to the email system and execute business email compromise. How many people are tracking the SVB collapse from a couple of weeks ago? You guys are following that. Business email compromise is especially dangerous in mortgages, in home loans, and when your bank collapses. Because an attacker that has gained access to your email system is going to wait for the right moment to inject a change in account numbers or routing numbers or so on in email and then steal money. And to be honest, unless that theft is greater than $100 million, the FBI is going to say, tough luck, go talk to your insurance provider. So it's actually an incredibly lucrative attack vector to steal money and completely get away with it with no legal recourse whatsoever. So business email compromise is incredibly dangerous as you go through like a bank collapse, or if you guys are getting a mortgage on a house, you're going to be wiring your money and you're going to get the escrow account information through email. And you want to make sure you're wiring it to the correct account. Well, how do you know that that PDF wasn't swapped by a malicious actor through a business email compromise? What's interesting, as we started running statistics on hash cracking, this is pretty common across all of our customers. 80% of the NTLM hashes we collect are cracked in 15 minutes or less using off-the-shelf GPU gear, nothing special. 80%. 10% of the service accounts had the user ID and password as the same. So think WebSphere admin, VMware admin, and so on. And the other interesting thing was the regional characteristics of passwords, where in New England, it was go Patriots, the Giants suck. Or in Miami, it's going to be, I hate Brady or whatever that might be. But you have this kind of pattern that you could find within regional teams. And then there was always some derivative off of that password. And once you understand that about an organization, cracking those passwords becomes even easier. You don't need quantum computers to go off and do a lot of this stuff. This is just basic password hygiene and policy issues that exist within an organization. And so once again, attackers don't hack in, they log in. I did notice this meme being used yesterday morning, which is just goes to show we have common humor as Purdue affiliates. By the way, is this a good use of your time so far? Kind of give me some stories? Cool. Third story out of 4 is a really interesting chain of events where this was another bank and they executed a pen test assuming initial compromise from a single machine. Once again, does recon and enumeration, organizes that data into a knowledge graph, and from here starts to fingerprint HP ILO. So how many people here have heard of HP ILO or Dell iDRAC, right? Anyone that uses storage usually has some sort of virtual appliance by the storage vendor to manage those storage devices. HP ILO, Dell iDRAC, they tend to be on custom operating systems that are not easy to monitor and are very difficult to patch. attackers know this. And so they look for iDRAC and they look for ILO devices and so on within the infrastructure. And in this example, we fingerprinted ILO, automatically where it was able to execute code execution or get code execution on the box. So now we're living on the box. ILO stores all of its user IDs and passwords in clear text in memory. So once you've gained initial access, you're able to dump that particular process. And now you've got a bunch of credentials. Credential pivot, gain domain user access to the machine next door. And what we do and what attackers will do also is start to pilfer the file system. In this case, there was a credentials file on that file system that turned out to be the production credentials for their AWS environment. This whole thing took less than 2 hours. This bank had every Gucci tool you could buy from every security vendor, yet not a single security alert got triggered because they weren't monitoring the ILO box, and everything thereafter was a valid user login, and nothing got tripped up and nothing got triggered. And this is just stunning as I think about how much of a false sense of security I had as a CIO, especially when you're talking about 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, or millions of hosts in your environment, and the various types of attack paths that are possible through basic misconfigurations. And once again, not a single CVE used in this particular attack. The final story I'll tell you is how this starts to get strung together from the outside in. So the first thing an attacker is going to do is conduct some sort of OSINT or open source intelligence research on that company. They're going to look for, and I built this slide while flying on a United Airlines flight on how I would compromise United Airlines. And not to get too much into it, but with my complexion, that triggered a whole bunch of nervous people around me. And then I had to put on my JSOC pin and people left me alone. But what's interesting is if you go to LinkedIn Sales Navigator, search the word pilot and look for your current employer is United Airlines, there are 7,000 pilots on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. All it takes is one of them to reuse a compromised Netflix password for their United Airlines login. That's it. So that's what attackers are going to do. They're going to go off and not log in 3 invalid times for one user, but log in once for all users. And that's not going to trigger any sort of account lockout procedures or so on. So they're going to go off and use OSINT to do likely credentials. From there, they're going to password spray to compromise that domain user. And then from there, in most shops, the domain user is also the local admin on their laptop. So think about that even for your own companies or even for the university. For many organizations, domain user is also local admin. Once you're a local admin, you can start to do things like dump SAM. You can start to get those NTLM hashes that I showed you earlier. You can start to crack those hashes. And now you start to live off the land and snowball from a domain user to a domain admin. What's amazing in this scenario is there was no magic defensive AI button to stop this. To prevent these attacks was basic hygiene. Do you have LAPS implemented, your local admin privilege management system? Do you have permissive Active Directory groups where domain users are also local admins? Do you have critical services patched? Are your tools actually configured correctly? There's a really delicious one, number 4 there. Trend Micro, as an AV tool, by default has OS credential dumping turned off. So there are a bunch of hedge funds we found on Wall Street where they spent millions of dollars on Trend Micro as a product, checked the box and told everybody they were good to go, but they had none of the features turned on. And so you could still do OS credential dumping as a result. Shockingly, in 10,000 pen tests, user behavior analytics products never detected our credential pivoting. And that's coming from the former CTO of Splunk, who was involved in acquiring, spending $200-something million buying a user behavior analytics company. And what I realized as we went through this over 10,000 pen tests is these user behavior analytics products require pristine logging data. And if your logging data isn't perfect, it is incapable of building the right baseline necessary to find abnormal usage of particular logins, as one example. Not only that, does anyone work at Dell SecureWorks? Cool. They're not a sponsor or partner, are they? All right. Otherwise, I would just flip to IBM. But it took Dell SecureWorks 7 hours to detect and respond to the initiation of a no-notice pen test. Their SLA was 5 minutes. And so that was another awkward conversation between the healthcare provider and their MSSP. And now they've got a way to hold those MSSPs accountable for the SLAs that they provide. And then finally, it took us 7 minutes and 19 seconds to go from unauthenticated user on the network to domain admin. Once again, it was not only were alerts rarely triggered, but in 7 minutes and 19 seconds, that isn't enough time for a security analyst to detect the alert, characterize the risk of the alert, and get approval to do something about it. A year later, that's now sub 60 seconds for us in many customers. And what I realized is that the future of cyber warfare is offensive algorithms fighting defensive algorithms with humans by exception. Because if you have 60 seconds or less to detect and respond to a particular attack, the human is the bottleneck. And I think there's going to be this really interesting and radical shift away from all the defensive products where the human is in the middle, in the loop, towards humans on the loop or humans out of the loop. And I think there's going to be a major disruption and shift in the defensive side of security products today. Because if an attacker, now we are, I think, the first to commercialize a cyber weapon, basically. And we basically built a cyber weapon that people use to shoot themselves. The adversaries are building similar cyber weapons to rapidly attack. And you saw Rob talk about some of that today in the ICS OT side of this idea of automating the delivery and execution of specific types of TTPs at scale across organizations. We should absolutely expect that to happen. So when we think about a year in review of 10,000 pen tests, and we did a pretty detailed write-up on this, what's interesting is a lot of this aligned, by the way, with what the FBI folks presented yesterday, but probably a little bit more detail. The biggest contributor to compromise was weaker default checks, credential checks and protocols, so default SSH credentials, default FTP credentials, and so on. And you can kind of see the distribution. You've got Active Directory misconfigurations through Kerber roasting. You've got weaker reused credentials. These were consistently the top 10 issues that we use to fully compromise organizations. And I bet you if we did this the year before and the year before that, it would have been almost the exact same list. And 9 out of 10 of these items are not CVEs. They're misconfigurations and bad credential policies within the organization. So what does that mean as I kind of wrap up here? The first is cyber is going to operate at machine speed, this idea of humans by exception. And I think we've got to really rethink what offense and defense look like. The second thing is this idea of cyber-enabled economic warfare. 1,000 companies withdrew from the Russian economy out of protest for their invasion of Ukraine. Every one of those companies is now going to draw the ire of a very capable cyber adversary that is Russia. Not only that, but it's their suppliers and their distributors. Because if I want to destroy Pfizer's business, I don't have to attack Pfizer directly. I can get their drugs to spoil en route. I can stifle manufacturing in their supply chain to cause a shortage. There are many ways to cause a catastrophic business outcome. And that's another big shift. Ransomware was about extortion. It was about profiteering. Economic cyber warfare is about business destruction. And I think now cyber shifts from being a cyber insurance CFO problem to a business continuity CEO level problem, because now you're directly affecting cash flow. And for every sanction we apply, we ban Russians from traveling, there's a cyber-enabled counterpunch that is below the threshold for war. And I remember a lot of these conversations we'd have in various exercises and war games of what is the threshold for war. And it's a very kind of loose discussion. There's a whole bunch of people that know that way better than I do in the room. But if we ban the Russians from traveling and they decide to use a cyber attack to delete the American Airlines travel database and no one's tickets are valid anymore, that is going to upset a whole lot of travelers. But that is not enough to trigger the 82nd Airborne to be mobilized and start to parachute into Moscow, right? That is going to be below the threshold of war. If there's a cyber attack that causes a train derailment and massive loss of life, different story. So you think about cyber-enabled economic warfare, it's achieving outcomes through the use of cyber below the threshold of war is the way that I think about it. When we banned Prada and Louis Vuitton and other luxury goods from being sold, the counter punch is to disrupt the supply chain, do things to affect retail so that we also have a shortage of those luxury goods. If the sanction here is banning Russian oil and gas, which we did, the cyber-enabled counterpunch is jamming up the Suez Canal, which happened through operator error, but it proved that gas prices could spike, stacked with attacking oil refineries, stacked with colonial pipeline type attacks. And if you can stack those 3 cyber attacks in one coordinated effort, gas prices spike to $100 a gallon 4 days before an election, right? Or a week before an election. That's where I think we've shifted into now, is this idea of cyber-enabled economic warfare. So what that requires for us as security practitioners is to shift from a peacetime mindset to a wartime mindset. And as I started to learn about the wartime mindset of cyber through my time in the national security world, we really looked at it in 3 ways. The first was looking at our enterprise through the eyes of the attacker. The second was when a router crashes, you don't know if it crashed because of an IT admin issue or because of a cyber attack. So one of the first things we did was merge those triage processes into one thing. If a router crashes, we treat it as both an IT outage and a cyber attack until someone proves definitively one way or the other. And that changes the muscle memory of the organization and how they react. It changes your strategy on observability. It changes your strategy around logging, monitoring, detection, and response, and your training in the cross-functional nature of troubleshooting and triaging issues as they occur. And then the final bit is the red and blue teams stop hating each other and they actually start to work together. This idea of purple teaming is not a product, it's a culture. It's a mindset that exists where the red team is working closely with the blue team to proactively verify the posture together. And the reason why I think Purdue becomes especially interesting, actually before that, if you don't then evolve from that mindset to the future of machine, speed, cyber warfare, the way I think this starts to tie in is you're using offense, those cyber terrain maps and attack paths and chains I talked about, that exploitable attack surface. You're chaining that or combining that with a variety of threat intel sources, and you're using that to drive defensive analysis and defensive orchestration. If you think about why cloud systems are a little bit harder to attack compared to on-prem legacy systems, they are ephemeral by nature, right? They can be created, destroyed, recreated. They're segmented by nature. They are revocable by nature with modern IDAM and IAM type processes. They're observable by nature. So if you think about these as characteristics of a future system, you start talking less about security and you start talking more about defensibility. I think that's going to be a shift in our vernacular as well. Security to me is a point in time state. I am secure right now. Defensible means I can rapidly adjust to an adaptive attacker. And how do I improve the defensibility of my infrastructure and have the knobs required to shape shift my environment to improve the defensibility of it? I think we're going to see that as a language shift in how we think about security posture going forward. The final part is why Purdue. I sincerely believe in my heart that Purdue should be the premier unicorn factory for cybersecurity companies. Hands down, I believe it. And I think that we haven't had much of that. But I think that, for me, and we were talking about it before, CERIAS over the next 25 years, absolutely, with the resources that Purdue has, this place should be the premier unicorn factory. And the reason why I believe that is a fewfold. First is this super unique intersection of expertise in cyber physical systems, which I think is the new huge emerging attack surface that not enough people are paying attention to, overlapped with strong data science and machine learning expertise that already exists, overlap with the ecosystem of partners spanning national security and industry. And it's the 3 of them together that makes 1 + 1 = 50. And I think that if you think about the universities that are out there, Purdue is right smack in the middle. I'll tell you what's not in the middle of that is Stanford, because they don't actually have a very robust integration with the national security community the way that Purdue does, as an example. And so it's a really unique opportunity. The next part is I think about this idea of excellence at scale. I think about the intangibles. Think about the placement and access of Purdue alumni across the industry, in national security, at NSA, at CIA, in the military. Think about the reach of that alumni that Purdue Global created with military folks in uniform using Purdue Global to increase their own skills. That is placement and access and brand recognition. Think about the security expertise that's been built up over 25 years here. And then finally, think about the adjacent areas of study and ecosystem in agriculture, energy, semiconductors, all the way through space and so on. Those adjacencies, I think, become important because when you think about cyber-enabled economic warfare, I very much think there's this corridor that people aren't paying attention to. And this corridor spans Texas with energy production to Michigan with manufacturing, from agriculture to space at Huntsville. And what's dab smack in the middle of that Purdue. This is probably also the single most important geopolitical corridor in the world, because the last 5 elections were decided by states in yellow, like that it cuts across. And probably the next however many elections are also going to be influenced by that. So if you believe that cyber-enabled economic warfare is the future, you believe that the primary attack surface below the threshold of war hits those industries in particular, and you think about the density of expertise and people affected by those industries, there's a really unique opportunity over the next 25 years to bring this together. And so that's where I get excited as an alumni. And I think about the diversity of folks in this room. And that's why I think that it's going to be awesome to see how this place evolves over the next 25 years. I hope this is a good use of your time. Questions, but thank you so much.
Any questions? Here comes a question.
I only know Neil in Hawaiian shirts.
Oh, okay.
So this is throwing me
Oh.
off.
Well, it's not Friday.
I know.
But, yeah, and thanks for the shout out at the beginning. It warms my heart to know I was able to help someone find an interesting path. But no, seriously, it's a fascinating sort of view on the drivers behind cyber attacks. But you had that loop, which I've seen many times before, right? Find, fix, recover, go find more, right? You're driving this autonomous pen testing. I've heard some people speculate on sort of autonomizing the other steps in that chain. What's your view on that? Is there potential for it? And if so, how would we go about pursuing it?
It's a great question. Find, fix, verify, I think brings together three categories. Your autonomous pen testing, which is the find, security, orchestration, and automation, so the SOAR type environment for the automated fix, and then detection engineering as a nascent discipline that's starting to emerge. Detection engineering is all about verifying that you can detect and respond effectively. So I look at it that way. The challenge we've had in industry, at least, is while SOAR was a great market buzz, it has not really been picked up at scale or implemented at scale. A lot of it is because people are uncomfortable letting fixes happen automatically. So it's much more of a psychological leap to overcome in SOAR than a technical hurdle, to be honest with you. And then detection engineering, I think, it's early, but it's an area that I think is going to really grow quickly. And how do we start to tie those 3 disciplines together into an integrated set of actions? And that's all white space for somebody to go win, because no one has done it yet. And who's got 2 thumbs and that's going to win it? This guy. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Snehal, for a very inspiring talk. So I actually feel very proud and excited by just looking at the slide that is displayed right now. So again, I have a question as a academic cybersecurity researcher. So you mentioned that during pen testing and also vulnerability study, statistics shows that not a whole lot of cyber attacks were started or triggered by vulnerabilities as expressed in CVEs and all that. In academia, we at least in our ecosystem, we take pride in discovering or developing advanced and crafty methods, techniques to find these vulnerabilities. And every time our discoveries turn into CVEs, we celebrate. So I'm just wondering, are we doing the right thing, or we need to shift our focus, because this is really research meeting reality. What is your take on that?
It's a phenomenal question. I think there's the glory of getting a CVE named, and there's a whole cottage industry around that. I think just as attackers have adapted, I think academia needs to adapt. I think that so the question is, well, what does academia adapt to? I think that SOAR, as an example, the orchestrated fixed actions, I don't believe SOAR should be, and this is a mistake we made at Splunk, I don't think, because we also bought a SOAR company, I don't think that SOAR is a proprietary set of content. I think SOAR should be open content. It's a phenomenal candidate for an open source project that starts to mobilize the fixer community together. And the trick with SOAR is writing fixed actions that are safe to execute against production. And I think that this intersection of academia, university, industry, and government rallying around this idea of safe to execute fixed actions is a very interesting area. In part because The bottleneck is not finding problems, it's fixing problems. It's the remediation services. The other bottleneck, though, is actually cyber ranges. So Rob talked about it earlier. You can't spin up an electrical grid in your basement and be able to do any sort of meaningful probing of misconfigurations and other techniques. And the limiting factor for why it's so difficult for ethical research attack researchers to move into adjacent and emerging attack surfaces like cyber physical systems or OT, ICS, and so on is the lack of ranges. And so I think another area is how do we do cyber ranges as a service in different areas of specialty that bring together a partnership with John Deere, as an example, to be able to hack tractors and do so in a way that's safe and that allows for the research and to evolve not beyond CVEs to source scripts, detection engineering scripts, and exploitable attack vectors. So I think that's going to become the natural evolution. It's less about the CVE and the glory. It's like patents. I've got 18 granted patents, utterly useless except to put on a wall and brag, right? And I kind of feel the same way. The CVEs are going the way of software patents.
Thank you. Yeah, so students and my fellow faculty take notes. Our alumni and our experts have spoken.
Yeah.
Thank you.